The more forward-looking you are, the more mature you are. The more your actions in the present are bound by the future. You might say, well, I just want to be happy. And first question is, what the hell do you mean by happy? Do you mean extroverted? Do you mean full of positive emotion? Do you mean you're not suffering? Like, what the hell do you mean happy? There is a much more profound way of evaluating life's utility than the hedonic evaluation, because many difficult things cause suffering but are worth doing.
So do you think people are less happy today than they were 20, 30 years ago?
Yes.
What do you think is the biggest cause of that?
Universities. Lies. Really, lies. You have to have an orientation towards the truth.
Yeah.
And it has to be a kind of terrified orientation.
What would you say is your biggest insecurity? We really appreciate you taking the time to come on the show. Like, seriously, it means a lot. The fact that
I've been looking forward to this for a very long time.
Years we've been hoping that this would happen. So it really does mean a lot. I know you're very busy. You have obviously the YouTube channel, the podcast, you just closed out the tour. And then of course, Peterson Academy, which I looked at the trailers. It looks amazing.
They're nice, eh?
Yeah.
Yes. The production quality. It's like, I look at that and I'm inspired. I'm like, I need production quality like that.
That's
for our
right.
show.
Up your game, man.
So during our research, we found a video of you where someone asked you about IQ, and you said you were previously tested quite a while ago, and you said it was in excess of 150. Granted, it does decline as you age. And you also said having a high IQ like that means that you have high volatility or variance in other areas of intelligence.
As intelligence increases, the variability in intelligence increases. So psychometrically, there's sort of one way to be not very bright and a variety of ways to be very bright. So there's differentiation at the upper end, right? And so I would say I'm not particularly gifted mathematically, so I struggled with statistics. I eventually figured it out, but it certainly didn't come to me easily. I don't tend to think mathematically. I've certainly had students who are like immeasurably more intelligent than me on the mathematical front. I had a student at Harvard. She went from zero statistics to winning teaching awards for teaching it in about 6 months. She was a little autistic. She was also a very good writer. That's a rare combination to have that extreme spatial mathematical intelligence and extreme verbal intelligence. You get a person like that now and then, but it's pretty rare.
And she was just coded that way to be able to do that? That wasn't anything that she did to be able to learn quickly?
IQ is very biologically determined. Very. And it's very rough. It's no wonder. My student and I, Daniel Higgins, who is a partner of mine in business still, we, at Harvard in the 1990s, we did a lot of work investigating the world of psychometric measurement. So that would be the assessment of cognitive ability and personality. And we delved very deeply into the literature on neuropsychological function. And so that's from a field that basically derived its information from animal experimental studies as well as study of human beings with various forms of brain damage. There was an effort, I don't know if that's still ongoing, to develop tests that would be associated, where people would show decrements that were associated with known areas of brain damage. They developed a lot of specialized tests. My student and I, on my old supervisor, we computerized a battery of so-called neuropsychological tests, and then we used them and IQ tests and personality to predict academic performance and managerial performance and like line worker performance, trying to figure out, well, two things. What exactly is it that makes someone productive depending on their positioning? And then also, how could that be measured effectively so that if you wanted to hire or place or promote, you could do that in the most effective possible manner. And so that meant that we had to thoroughly familiarize ourselves with the neuropsychological literature, which I already kind of knew, with the IQ literature, which was quite new to me, and then with the personality literature. And so the basic claim of the psychometricians on the IQ side is that for all intents and purposes, IQ is relatively unitary. So intelligence, general cognitive ability. Personality is multidimensional, but cognitive ability, although it differentiates at the upper end, is a pretty solid unit. And so And no one likes that idea. And no wonder. It's no wonder. So why would people not like it? Well, it seems very unfair and anti-egalitarian to note that there's wide variation in the trait that is the best predictor of long-term success in complex occupations. It's not like the cards are dealt out equally. They're not dealt out equally
How
at
much
all.
of that is genetic?
Most of it.
So if you have smart parents, you're probably going to be
smart.
smart.
Parents, you're going to be slightly less smart than the average of your parents. Because imagine that your intelligence isn't determined only by your parents, it's determined in a way by the whole stream of your ancestry. Now, if you have two smart parents, on average, their ancestors are going to be slightly less smart than they are. So you get the best way to predict your IQ, if we didn't know anything else, would be to take the IQ of your mother and father and average them and then reduce it somewhat, because that's called regression towards the mean. So there's a tendency for biological forms to default back to their standard configuration.
Or increase it if the average was lower than...
Yeah, that's right. So if you had two parents who were impaired in their cognitive ability or far below average, on average, you'd be smarter than they were.
Would that then suggest that with enough time, we're all going to be about even? If everyone's kind of...
The average is IQ. The average is 100. So
hasn't it been going up over time, though?
There's debate about that. It's gone up over time in some ways, for sure. So although it's difficult to increase IQ, you get companies now and then who pop up and claim that they can increase your cognitive function. There's zero evidence for that. There's no... What happens if you practice a complex task, you tend to get much better at the complex task, say a video game, but it doesn't transfer over and make you generally smarter. No one's figured out how to increase IQ with cognitive exercises. You can maintain or increase your IQ with exercise, cardiovascular and weightlifting, because your brain is a very demanding organ. So if your cardiovascular system is healthy, especially as you age, that's a huge deal. There's nothing that you can do that's more important than staying in physical shape to maintain your cognitive ability. So, but nobody knows how to increase it. I mean, that would be a discovery of infinite value, but no one's figured it out. You can suppress IQ quite easily by, say, not stimulating young children to the degree that their intelligence has room to play, let's say, or by not breastfeeding them. That's a good way to have stupider children, if that's what you're after. Breastfeeding confers, I think, something like a 3 to 4 point increment per year breastfed. It's something like...
Why is that? Is it just the bond?
Nutrition. The brain's a very demanding organ. And so it uses a tremendous amount of your metabolic resources. And so nutrition and exercise make a huge difference. So if you asked about biological determinism with regards to IQ. So imagine that you take identical twins who were separated at birth, and then you track their IQ as they age. Well, by the time they're 60, their IQs are so similar, regardless of their background, that it's as if you're testing the same person twice. So strangely enough, if IQ is environmentally determined, you'd expect twins separated at birth to diverge as they age. They don't, they converge. So
I can see why that makes people very upset.
There's a whole bunch of reasons to be upset by it. I mean, when Daniel and I sorted this out in the 90s, we thought that this might be the shoal upon which Western culture demolishes itself, because IQ is a vicious predictor of long-term success. It's by far the best predictor. It's 5 times as powerful as conscientiousness, which is the next best predictor. So conscientiousness is associated with industriousness and orderliness. It's associated with political conservatism. It's associated with traditionalism. Outgroup, let's say, skepticism towards outgroups to some degree. That's conservatism more. But and we probably can't measure conscientiousness as accurately as we can measure IQ. We have to rely on personality scales and self-report and reports from other people. That's the best we've been able to manage, and no one has been able to come up with a practical test of conscientiousness. Like, I've probably tried 50 things in my lab, bringing conscientious people into the lab, giving them different sorts of tests, seeing if we could figure out what activity conscientious people would do better in the lab, so we could use that as a measure. We could never do it. So we did things like, for example, imagine you have rows of N's, M's, U's, which are visually quite difficult to distinguish. Imagine a variety of rows of those, and then your job is to go through and circle all the N's. You'd think perhaps that would be associated with something like diligence or industriousness, conscientiousness, but it's just another IQ test. It's very, very hard to find a cognitive test that isn't just IQ. And IQ is very easy to measure. This is another thing that makes it troublesome, let's say, apart from the fact of unbelievable variation between people. Like people with extreme IQs are so much more productive than people with on the lower end of the scale, that they're not in the same universe in a sense. And they're certainly in the same moral universe, and they have the same value intrinsically. And IQ is not associated with morality, let's say. Just because you're smarter doesn't mean you're a better person. And in fact, I think there's a temptation that comes along with intelligence that's Luciferian, and that's been warned about in mythologies forever. Bitter intellect, the person who has been gifted by God, so to speak, with a great intellect, who believes that the world should bow at their feet in consequence, or presumes that their rational, what would you say, their cogitations produce systems of value that should be imposed upon the world. That's the Luciferian temptation. But there's a massive difference between people at the upper end of the cognitive distribution and people at the lower end. And so it's easy to measure. It's very robust. So for example, imagine you had a library of 10,000 questions. Questions about anything. They require abstract cognition to solve. That's the only criteria. Multiple choice questions, vocabulary questions, general knowledge questions, mathematical questions, spatial rotation questions, anything that requires abstract cognition. Okay, so they have 10,000 questions. Extract out a random set of 100 questions, give that to 100 people, sum their scores, rank order them. That's IQ. Now, the technical IQ test is correct for age, but that's irrelevant with regards to the measurement.
But before we get into that, we got to do some quick math, because the less money your business spends, the more money you get to keep. And with higher expenses on materials, employees, distribution, and borrowing, everything is costing more. So to reduce costs and headaches, smart businesses are upgrading to our sponsor, Netsuite by Oracle.
NetSuite is the #1 cloud financial system that brings in accounting, HR, financial management, and inventory into one platform with one source of truth. With NetSuite, you could reduce IT costs because NetSuite lives in the cloud with no hardware required, and it's accessible from anywhere. You could basically cut the cost of maintaining multiple systems because with this you have one unified business management suite. Essentially, you could improve efficiency by bringing all of your major business processes into one platform, thereby slashing manual tasks and errors. Over 37,000 companies have already made the move, so do the math and see how much you'll profit with NetSuite.
And just for the Iced Coffee Hour family, NetSuite has decided to extend its one-of-a-kind flexible financing program for just a few more weeks at netsuite.com/iced. Once again, for the one-of-a-kind deal, head over to netsuite.com/iced, netsuite.com/ICED. Thank you so much, NetSuite, for sponsoring this episode and making all of this possible. And with that said, back to the episode. AI might just be the most important new computer technology out there. We use it on every single episode of the Iced Coffee Hour. It's storming every industry, and literally billions of dollars are being invested, so you better buckle up.
The problem, however, is that AI needs a lot of speed and processing power, so how do you compete without your costs spiraling out of control? Well, that's why it's time to upgrade to the next generation of the cloud, Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, or our sponsor, OCI. For those unaware, OCI is a single platform for your infrastructure, database, application development, and AI needs. OCI also offers 4 to 8 times the bandwidth of other clouds, offers one consistent price instead of variable regional pricing, and of course, nobody does it better than Oracle.
So now you can train your AI models at twice the speed and less than half the cost of other clouds. So if you want to do more and spend less, like Uber, 8x8, and Databricks Mosaic, take a free test drive of OCI at oracle.com/iced. Once again, guys, it is completely free to try it out. I highly recommend it. We have a link down below in the description, or you can go to oracle.com/ICED, oracle.com/iced. Thank you so much, Oracle, for sponsoring this episode, and back to the podcast.
So what does it mean to have an IQ over 150? How do you experience life in that way? Because Elon has said on a podcast before that his mind is like a storm, and that most people probably
he's probably also a little on the manic side. Like, so there's a phenomena. one of the phenomena that's associated with creativity is known as fluency, and people who are fluent idea generators generate a lot of ideas. Now, that can get out of control. It gets out of control in mania. And people like Musk, probably people like me, a lot of creative people, a lot of writers in particular, have a manic edge, and so they're being flooded with ideas constantly. So like this isn't quite so much the case for me anymore. Maybe it's a consequence of being older. Might also be a consequence of having my nervous system in somewhat more stable configuration. But when I was writing my first book, Maps of Meaning, like I was thinking about that book when I wasn't doing my research, let's say, which was kind of a break for me in many ways. I was thinking about that like 16 hours a day, nonstop, like ideas, a verbal stream of ideas associated were running through my head at high speed, constantly.
How are
so
you ever?
Musk is gonna have that aspect. That's fluency. So you can do a fluency test. Fluency tests are actually pretty straightforward too. So one of the ways of measuring fluency, for example, is I would say, well, write down as many 4-letter words that begin with the letter S in 3 minutes. So, or you can use words of any length beginning with any letter, and you score that. For pure fluency, you just score that for number of words generated. And if you do that with a typical group of 50 people, some people will generate like 8 words and some people will generate 300. That's a big difference. And then you can there's other fluency tests that assess more creativity, which is associated with IQ, but creativity has an additional element, which is captured by the personality trait openness to experience. Creative people, so imagine that if you bring an idea to mind, there's some probability that an associated idea will come along for the ride. One thing reminds you of another.
Yes.
Okay, now imagine that you assessed 100 people and you gave each of them a prompt and they wrote down what came to mind. A lot of the things that were written down would be similar, right? And that's partly how we can understand each other. An idea means something similar to you that it means to me. The more creative people, though, are going to have other ideas come to mind that are more distal and statistically unlikely. So they make longer leaps, right? And that can degenerate into insanity as well, right? Because you can make leaps that are unwarranted or that are incomprehensible to other people. You see that fragmenting in schizophrenia, for example, and often in mania.
Where does confidence come in? Because I feel like you could be very smart but not take action on anything.
There's no technical definition of confidence. There's no psychometric definition. But confidence and self-esteem, which is also a very ill-defined phrase, they mostly load on trait neuroticism. So the two of the main personality traits are associated with emotion. So people who experience more positive emotion or have a lower threshold for positive emotion, those are extroverts. And people have a lower threshold for negative emotion. So that'd be anxiety, grief, shame, pain. There's more, but that's the basic cluster. They're more likely to experience negative emotion on a regular basis, plus their threshold for experiencing it is lower. It takes less to activate it. So confident people are lower in neuroticism. Now, you could also add some extroversion to that, right? So the typical person that you would experience as hyperconfident would be low in neuroticism, so very free of anxiety, for example, and somewhat high in extroversion because that makes them outgoing. So they're not anxious, they're not inhibited. Anxiety freezes you, right? So, and makes you wary, and it'll inhibit speech, for example. Extroverts are more fluent. So a confident person would be someone who's high in extroversion and low in neuroticism. Now, there's variance of that too. So you might experience a disagreeable person as more confident because a disagreeable person, that's another personality dimension. It's associated with femininity, as is neuroticism. A disagreeable person will tell you to go to hell. So you can have a quiet, disagreeable person who is pretty confident because they're going to say no to you if they're inclined to, and they'll tell you to go to hell when they feel it's necessary or maybe just randomly.
What was your disagreeability? Wasn't it?
It was extreme.
Low?
My disagreeability.
It was very low. I think I remember it.
Really.
So
we're going to put the
you're low
score.
in agreeableness?
Yes.
So he's feminine, is what he's saying.
No.
No,
Low
that's the
agreeableness
opposite.
makes you masculine.
Yeah.
And you kind of look like that.
Oh.
Your face has got a...
I was agreeable. So.
Yeah, Jack was the
I was
agreeable one.
okay. All right. Well, we don't need to go into agreeability.
I was the disagreeable one, but
and femininity.
Looks
But
like
that's why it worked so well. between us. We
Yeah.
get along very well.
Well, disagreeable people
Yeah.
are skeptical, eh?
Yeah.
Their default position is like, yeah, I fucking doubt it,
Yeah.
right? So, and an agreeable person is something like anything you want, dear.
Yeah.
Now,
Well, I'm not that agreeable.
the
Almost.
upside of being agreeableness, as I said, is a more feminine trait. And the reason that agreeableness, it's useful in, it's likely useful in intimate family situations. And so a good default stance towards infants is agreeableness, right? Because an infant between the ages of 0 and 9 months is always right. Like if an infant is in distress, your job as a caregiver is to attend to the infant, not to make value judgments, not to be skeptical. It's like, and that's partly because human infants are so, we're born early because of our head size. So a mammal of our size should have a gestation period of 2 years, not 9 months. So human infants are born prematurely in a sense. And so they're very helpless. And so it's necessary to be very agreeable in their care because they're obviously, especially before they can move, they're 100% dependent. Now, the problem with that is that being agreeable isn't the best thing for dealing with children as they mature. And it's certainly not the thing that you use to deal with, let's say, adult males or institutions. I mean, one of the things that's pathologizing the world at the moment is the proclivity of women to use agreeableness as their default rule of moral presumption in situations where it's completely inappropriate. Disagreeable managers are more successful than agreeable managers because they can't be taken advantage of. That's the problem with being agreeable. Then also it generates resentment because if you're agreeable and you are pouring yourself out in others' care constantly, then it's easy to feel that you're not being appreciated properly. And perhaps you're not necessarily that good at bargaining on your own behalf. Now, if you're disagreeable, you can also be a complete son of a, it's like, all of the personality dimensions have their pathologies especially at the extremes. And you can't say one is better than the other. If you're a sophisticated actor, what you do with your personality over time is you expand its range so that you can match your behavior to the demands of the current situation. So disagreeable people, they tend to say no. They're very skeptical, so they can miss opportunities. They're suspicious of people. And, that's real useful if the person you're suspicious of is a bad actor. But it's not that helpful if the person isn't. So you pay a price. You pay a price for everything you have, right? It's in one way or another.
One of the most transformative messages that you put out is the importance of taking personal responsibility in the biggest way possible. And in fact, on Rogan, you asked yourself, what is the meaning of life? And you concluded that it's the meaning that reveals itself when you take maximal responsibility for your own life. Could you discuss the philosophical...
Why did that strike you?
Because I think the meaning of life is a question that everyone asks themselves all of the time. And at different parts of time in your life, you're always coming to different answers. And I thought that is
different wrong answers.
Sure, different wrong.
Well,
would you say this is a wrong answer?
I talked to a philosopher yesterday, and we were discussing modern conceptualizations of divinity, let's say, conceptualizations of God. And there's a line of philosophical thinking now that is philosophers who are debating whether existence itself and hypothetically the spirit that gave rise to existence can be characterized as evil or good. Because if you look at the world, you could say, well, the amount of suffering outweighs the amount of pleasure. And so therefore, existence itself has questionable utility. That's what the antinatalists presume. That's what Goethe's Mephistopheles pronounced. He was a great, hero to Karl Marx, the ultimate antinatalist. But it's a foolish way of conceptualizing the world because it presumes that the right axis of evaluation is something like pleasure versus pain, like it's a hedonic evaluation. Well, I don't think that's true. I don't think that's true at all. I don't think it's true existentially. Partly, here's a reason. You might say, well, I just want to be happy. And first question is, what the hell do you mean by happy? Do you mean extroverted? Do you mean full of positive emotion? Do you mean you're not suffering? Do you mean you're calm? Like, what the hell do you mean happy? So it's a very ill-defined term. But but it's also not even obvious that is what you want. So what might you want instead? Well, here's a question. It's like, what memories can you draw on that, what would you say, situate you most effectively in existential space? So imagine that you're taking yourself apart with your conscience, wondering whether or not you're a worthwhile person, evaluating yourself morally. You don't look back in your past and ask yourself how often you were happy. Like, that's just pointless. What you do is you go over your biography, let's say, and you think about, if you're trying to defend yourself from your own accusations even, you think about those times where even under duress, you pushed the boulder successfully up the bloody hill. And the funny thing is that those situations without the difficulty wouldn't have the same impact. And so there is a much more profound way of evaluating life's utility than the hedonic evaluation, which I think is very primitive and pointless, because many difficult things cause suffering but are worth doing. Marriage does that. Children do that. Like any career that's worthy of its name, any job that's worthy of its name. It's not, you can't evaluate its utility on the basis of its happiness. That problem, the fact that we do that by default is nothing but an index of how pathological our culture is. We just assume axiomatically that the right evaluation, even for the quality of life, is the hedonic evaluation. That means we're basically hedonists. That's not a helpful orientation in the world. It's very immature. It's very immature.
What I find interesting is you also mentioned on another podcast, for conflict resolution in a relationship, let's say you're being annoyed by your wife or your girlfriend or something. You can open up that conversation with, "You're annoying me." Now, maybe that's me. Maybe it's my fault. Maybe I shouldn't be annoyed. And if it is me, I'd like to fix that.
Yep.
So please tell me it's me if you think
Well, you might want to even open it with the statement, not so much "you're annoying me," but the statement, "I'm annoyed."
So it's
right?
personal.
Well,
Yes.
there's no accusation there. It's
Right.
a statement of emotional fact, let's say. I'm annoyed. Okay, well, why? Well, it couldn't be you, and that's the simplest solution for me, except that I have to live with you if you're my wife. So it's not that simple a solution. But in the moment, it would maximize my hedonism to assume it was you. That's the thing. We should emphasize that a bit more, is that emotional orientation is, by definition, immature. Like a 2-year-old is run by emotion. Once you mature, you can even think of this technically. As you mature, the control over your perception and behavior moves from instinct-based subcortical structures that govern motivation and emotion, their instincts, to the cortex, which is context-dependent, future-oriented, and communitarian. So, my happiness isn't as important. Let's say my moment-to-moment happiness isn't as important or as meaningful as the psychological and physiological health of my family. So you make sacrifices for that. And life is a sacrificial enterprise.
I even put myself in the hypothetical situation of this. Let's just say, I got a girlfriend, she was annoying me, and I imagined myself being the person saying, "I'm annoyed by you and it's probably my fault. And if it is, I want to fix that." And it even made me like a little bitter. Like I was already it had already hurt my
It's very
pride.
annoying.
But it's good because it strips away the ego entirely and makes it completely solution oriented. It removes the emotions.
But that's assuming the other person's solution oriented too.
But if you're
Yes,
vulnerable,
it also assumes that the solution that you're negotiating towards is one of peace and harmony, right? So you need a that's part of what constitutes a valid religious orientation in the technical sense. It's like, well, what the notion of solution presumes an orientation towards some end. Well, what's the end? Well, that's the religious question. What's the ultimate end? That's the religious question. And it's like, well, why not, if it's your wife and she's annoying you, like, why not just beat her until she stops doing those things? And you say, well, no reasonable person would do that. It's like, well, first of all, you have a lot of, what would you say? You have a lot of unwarranted faith in reason, that's for sure, because it's not obvious at all that that's not a reasonable solution, especially if it worked. That's certainly what tyrants think. It's not like they're unreasonable. So let's say you're oriented towards something like long-term peace and mutual aid and benefit, right? Till death do us part, in sickness and in health, right? And so you're viewing the relationship over the longest possible period of time. And then you're presuming that the other person is indistinguishable from you in that regard. Because they are. If you're married, it's like the person that you're married to is there with you all the time. There's no separation between you and her. Not if you're really thinking about it, because the quality of your experience is dependent upon one another. And so you make a unit. Now, the Christian ideal, this is an ideal that lurks underneath some, but not all, modes of sanctifying the union between men and women. The Christian concept is that you put the union of the two of you at the pinnacle, and that union is the recreation of the original Adam. Because the original Adam, before he was separated into male and female, was both, an amalgam of both, a kind of hypothetical perfect being, hermaphroditic figure. That, anyways, the idea is that you put this, and that's equivalent to Christ, by the way, weirdly enough. The idea is that there's a union of purpose and perception and action that can be attained by the communication between a couple. And you want to elevate that above both of your limited self-interest. So you're always negotiating towards that. It's like, how do we idealize this union? So then if that's your orientation and you're engaged in some strife, the logical question is, okay, who the hell's got the problem here? Because maybe it's you, and like I said, that'd be convenient for me in a way, except I'm stuck with you. But maybe it's me. And then there's another impediment that isn't merely egotistical. It would be lovely for you to presume that you're right, and people love to do that. But there's another reason for that too. That's sort of outlined in Dante's Inferno. Because what you see is, if there's a recurring problem in your relationship, even your relationship with yourself, is that there's something underneath that's driving it. And unpacking that is a journey into hell. That's why people don't do it. Like if you have a problem in your marriage, that's a real problem, and you delve into it, it's like surgery for an infection. You'll get to the bottom of it. It will not be fun. And something seriously ugly is down there. And so that's down the rabbit hole in the Dante's Inferno. Now, Dante put betrayers at the lowest level of hell. And that's pretty damn accurate, because often what you'll find is, if there's a recurring problem in a relationship, the reason that problem is there is because, let's say, the person who's primarily responsible for that particular problem has been betrayed in some way that's either stopped their development at a certain age, so they're immature, or that's rendered them bitter and distrustful. And so you see a lot of problems between men and women in that manner, because there's an element of the female psyche that distrusts men as a category. And the same is true for men. They distrust women as a category. And that's a real problem in a particularized relationship like a marriage. It's like, well, why don't you trust men? Well, maybe you're a woman who never had a positive experience with a man in your whole goddamn life. That's increasingly common, right? All the men you knew were absent. Sporadic relationships with your mother, nothing dependable, right? Or you a series of sponges, or worse, right? Exploiters.
How do you best work on those issues to fix them?
Which issues?
I would say anything that's under the surface, like you're talking about finding an infection and going down and surgically removing it. How do you even begin to broach those topics with a significant other?
Well, in my marriage, when Tammy and I got together, we'd known each other for a very long time by that point, but I indicated to her that if we were going to be together, we were going to tell each other the truth. That's a hard thing. And so it's hard in a sense. It's hard in the short term. That's another one of these indications that the hedonistic orientation is wildly lacking. There's nothing the least bit entertaining about solving a serious psychological problem. And I'm oddly constituted for that, because I don't like conflict. It really upsets me. And so it's hard for me to delve into underlying problems. But what I like even less is having those problems continue. It's like, no, we're solving this right now. And so what does that mean? Well, it'll eventually mean tears on one person's part or the other. Might mean some screaming. God only knows. People have all sorts of ways of putting up resistances to that kind of inquiry too. You're mean. Well, and maybe you are. Leave me alone. I'll stomp out. I don't want to talk about this. Turn red, get angry, accuse you of all sorts of things. And you have to be able to persevere through that. And that also means that you have to have faith in the motives for your inquiry, because maybe you are just being a cruel son of a bitch and you won't let the person alone, going into their past and mucking about. So then the question there is, well, how can you trust yourself? Well, don't lie. That's the bottom line. It's like you want to trust yourself in a difficult negotiation. You better bloody well be sure that your orientation is upward. And how do you be sure of that? You evaluate yourself the same way you evaluate anyone else. If you're in a relationship with someone, they lie to you constantly, you're not going to trust them. It's no different for you. So that's why you have to have an orientation towards the truth.
Yeah.
And it has to be a kind of terrified orientation. And that's easy for me because I know what happens to people when they don't solve their proximal relationship problems. They end up in some sort of hell, divorce court hell. That's fun, especially if you have a few kids. You can be miserable for 20 years in divorce court hell.
See, I tend to be conflict avoidant, like you mentioned, but I also tend to think in those situations, in the big picture, most of what's going on is not that big of a deal. And
Yeah.
so I rationalize that, hey, we have a great life. A lot of things are going well. This, a month from now, we're not even going to remember.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
to me,
look,
it's like a lot of those things, just let it go.
Well, the question is, what's the rule? Don't make a mountain out of a molehill. So, and that's a perfectly reasonable rule. But another rule is, don't be willfully blind. Okay, so how do you distinguish between those two things? With my clients, I would have them implement something like a rule of 3. So you bother me. It's like, once, irrelevant. Why? Who knows what's up with you? Maybe you're hungry. I don't know or maybe it's me. The fact that we had some emotional upset between us once, it might alert you, but it contains virtually no information, right? So you just think, well, we'll just let that lie. Twice, same thing. It's like, oh, that's twice. Okay. So now that's a bit more serious. Now I'm watching you a little harder. 3 times? Well, then I tell you, you did it this time, you did it this time, you did it this time. It's the same thing. I saw it and I'm not deluded. So a rule of 3 is a good one. It's a good one because it gives you, and you can make it 4 or you can make it 5. I don't care. But once isn't good because then you fly off the handle at everything. And so you do want to let go what can be let go. Well, what is that? Things that don't repeat. It's the repetition that's the problem, right? Because, well, and people also don't construe their lives very intelligently in this regard because we tend to focus our lives on the exceptional. Vacations, for example, or special occasions. It's like, that's foolish. Your life is what you do every day. The mundane things you do every day, that's 95% of your life. You want to get those right. And if there are things that interfere with those, like maybe every time you put your kids to bed, it's miserable. Well, that's not good because you probably only spend 20 minutes of one-on-one time with any given kid on average every day. So if bedtimes are miserable, that's your relationship. Well, that's no good. You've got to fix that. Or maybe, there's unpleasantness when you come home after work or at breakfast or lunch. I don't know. If it repeats, it's a problem. So that's what you're looking for, is repeating patterns of discord. And if they repeat, well, the basic rule is if something repeats, it's not going to stop until you fix it. Your wife or you might be acting out patterns of misbehavior that have cascaded down the generations for God only knows how long.
So a few weeks back, I mentioned a new dating app I got set up on called The League, and I gotta say, it is a complete twist to modern dating apps I've never seen before. The League is specifically made for people that are career-focused, ambitious, and short on time. You'll find doctors, lawyers, creatives. It's just a pool of really motivated and ambitious people. They also vet every single person that joins, so everyone is LinkedIn verified and actually serious about finding the right match. So the way it works is The League sends me a curated batch of matches every single day, and on Sundays, they have these 3-minute mini dates where you can quickly see if there's a connection. You're basically put up to talk to somebody else that you know very little about. It tested my confidence, honestly, a lot. Learned a lot about myself, and also it's a great way to meet new people and see if there's chemistry right away. So I've been on The League for a couple weeks now, and I gotta say, it has overall been a very good experience. I love their multi-city dating options for when I'm on the road for podcasts, and on top of that, their search filters are second to none. What I find crazy is that The League is a 50-50 ratio men to women, which is basically unheard of on dating apps. Honestly, I'm just really enjoying using The League, and if you want to upgrade your dating life too, I recommend you guys try out The League. You can download it on iOS or on Android, and the best part is, if you want to skip the entire wait list, all you got to do is message #ICH to the in-app concierge. Thank you so much to The League for sponsoring this episode, and back to the podcast.
If you're a business owner, you know there's no better sound than hearing. And if you want to hear a bunch more, then it's time to get started with our sponsor, Shopify. For those unaware, Shopify is the global e-commerce platform that's already helped transform millions of businesses worldwide.
What I love about Shopify is they have thousands of integrations, third-party apps, and flexible templates to help you customize your online store exactly how you want. And what sets Shopify apart is their ability to turn browsers into buyers with the internet's best converting checkout that's 36% better on average than other leading e-commerce platforms. And Shopify actually powers 10% of all e-commerce in the United States, supporting brands like Allbirds, Rothy's, and Brooklinen in over 175 countries.
In fact, you might not know this, but my coffee company, bankrollcoffee.com, is run exclusively through Shopify. And when we were first starting out, they were the best option that we researched by far. They also have an award-winning support team that's there to help you every step of the way.
So sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/ICH, all lowercase, shopify.com/ICH to grow your business no matter what stage you're in. Shopify.com/ICH. Thank you so much, Shopify, and back to the episode.
You talk about the importance of honesty and truth quite a bit, which is another thing that resonates with me a lot. And I like to have certain rules and guidelines in my life that I know can make decisions, so I don't have to leave that to my subjective, random, arbitrary decision-making machine that I have. So if someone sets out to only ever tell the truth, would that be setting themselves up for success or failure? And is there ever a time to not be truthful? For example, we've asked guests on this podcast before. Tom Bilyeu, funny enough, had a really interesting answer to this, which is, if your wife doesn't look good in a dress, do you tell her?
You say, don't ask me questions like that unless you want the answer. My answer to that is yes, you tell her. But the thing is questions like that aren't realistic in a way because they strip out the necessary context. You can't tell your wife how she looks in a given outfit unless you've negotiated how to do that thoroughly. Right? So that would mean, for example, that both you and her are pleased if she looks attractive. And you might say, well, of course a husband's going to be pleased if his wife looks attractive. It's really? How attractive? And to who? And when exactly? And also why? And those are very complicated issues. And so you see, there's no shortage of men who punish their wives every single time they look attractive. Just like there are no shortage of wives who punish their husbands every time they do anything competent. You might say, well, why would that happen? Well, let's say you've had bad experiences with men and you can't distinguish between competence and tyranny. So every time a man makes a decision to do something, you see that as a manifestation of patriarchal power and you quash it. And then a year later, your husband's completely useless. And you wonder why you've been saddled with him, but that's fine because you can play martyr to your friends. And so that's a good deal for everybody. And so the same thing applies to attractiveness on the part of your wife. It's do you trust her? And how short should her skirt be when she goes to the bar with her friends? Exactly. And when are you going to say something about it? Well, there's a lot of preparation work that has to be done before you. If my wife asks me if something that looks good on her, I tell her. And lots of things look good on her, so that's a good deal. And I buy a lot of her clothes, which I find extremely entertaining. She also, the reason you want to be able to tell her is because she has to be able to trust you. But she also has to not play stupid games, because the stupid game is, well, I'm asking you if I look good in this dress, but really what I'm trying to figure out is, do you love me? That's not a straight game. It's like, are you asking whether I love you, or are you asking whether or not I look good in this dress? And people are often very murky in their questions. You don't know what the hell they're up to, and neither do they. And so it's very difficult to respond in a truthful manner when you're in a complex situation and 5 different things are going on. I know it's the white lie conundrum, right?
Yeah.
If you ever have to tell a white lie, you haven't set the situation up properly. There are times when the best you might be able to manage in that situation is a white lie, but that doesn't make it good.
There are other situations that I can think of. Like, for example, let's say there's been a long relationship. These people have been married for like 10 years, but then there's an ex of the guy, and she reaches out to the guy for no reason. And this was a girl that your current wife has always had a little bit of come on, what's going on over there? Like, they always were very insecure. They felt uneasy about that past relationship, right? And you've tried your best to talk it through, but you haven't done it, I guess, to make her comfortable enough. And you don't know if you can. Well, she texts you. Do you tell your wife that she texted you knowing it's just going to devolve into this thing when you have no feelings for your ex at all whatsoever, but you know it's going to create a catastrophe, all these arguments and plates will be thrown, whatever? Do you still tell her, or do you just throw it to the side because it means nothing to you?
Well, any secrets that you keep from your wife, like, you don't have to tell anyone everything. I mean, first of all, who wants that? Like, and you have a right to privacy, but keeping secrets from the person who's adjacent to you is not helpful. It's just not helpful, because it means there are areas of your shared life that are off limits. And partly that's not good for you, because then you don't have access, let's say, to her intelligence and perception in those situations. No, like, I would have to know the details, because the details in a situation like that matter. But the optimal solution to that problem is to work it out so that that problem no longer exists, so that you're not jealous of each other's exes. And, that's complicated because, well, are you fully committed to your wife? Like, and why should she believe that? What do you mean fully? Exactly. And so those are very complicated issues, and people check each other out with regard to such things all the time. Little kids will misbehave, especially if you bring them to a new situation. And you might say, why the hell are they misbehaving? They know perfectly well what the consequences of that will be, especially if you're, a diligent disciplinarian and the rules are minimal but clear. While you bring your kids to a new situation and they act up. Well, why? Well, because they want to see what you'll do. Well, why? Because what you do defines the new situation. And they'll risk punishment for that. They want to know. So they'll bug you, even if they're bugging you in a way that has resulted in something unpleasant for them consistently in the past. It's like, no, I want to know. Well, a lot of that's relationship between a man and a woman. It's like, what are you up to? Well, did you ask me straightforwardly? Well, probably not, because that's hard. But that I could torture you into some revelation, and I want to know, because my life depends on it. So people play pretty rough games. It's better to get the game straight. That's hard. Because the question, how committed are you to your wife, that's sort of indistinguishable from the question, how committed are you to your own life? How committed are you to the journey up Jacob's ladder? How interested are you in spending some time in hell just because it's entertaining and you don't have anything better to do? These are hard things to sort out. How much trouble do you want to cause exactly for that? Exactly for the delight of having the problem, a false adventure.
So everyone needs to be playing the same rules of the game.
That's the minimal basis.
Basic understanding.
Yeah. You got to have a constitutional framework in your marriage, let's say. It's a bit more complex than that, because you also have to agree on the rules of transformation. So let's say you have a friend and you can play a game with the friend, but now you have a little bit more sophisticated friend and you can play this game and that game. And then an even more sophisticated friendship would involve a multitude of qualitatively different games. Well, then you need to negotiate transition rules, right? How do we change the game we're playing? So that's a bit more complex than just the constitutional framework per se. But yeah, you have to. Well, that's what traditions do for people mostly. It's like men and women, in principle, once had traditional roles. Well, why? Well, you want to negotiate every little thing with your wife? Just try. Who should do the dishes and when? You could spend 5 years figuring that out. All the, what would you say, resentment and irritation that come along with the kitchen. God, what a mess. It's very difficult for people to negotiate a relationship from scratch. And so generally what human beings do is default to something approximating tradition because it solves the complex problem. And then, the radicals go in there and muck up the tradition, and then people are just lost. They have no idea what to do. They have no idea how to negotiate. They don't even know what they want. Like many people, when they're conversing, it's like they throw out an indication of their misery, but it's ill-defined and you have no idea what would satisfy it. Neither do they. It's like an endless mining expedition.
So do you think people are less happy today than they were 20, 30 years ago?
Yes.
But what do you think is the biggest cause of that? Do you think it's comparison? Do you feel like it's social
Universities, lies, really, lies.
The way that I boiled down my university experience in the most simplest of forms was, I went to UCSB. I don't know if I'm going to even shout out the Gauchos. Should I even be doing that anymore? I had an okay time there. I had a fun time. But I feel like even from when I was younger, I noticed a change from the teachers teaching you how to think versus teaching you what to think. It completely changed. I feel like, honestly, in high school, which was like 2013 to 2017, it went from expanding your brain to solve problems for yourself versus this is what you should think. So I don't know if that's how college should be, because obviously you do need to understand the curriculum. They need to be teaching you mathematics and stuff like that. So, what it is that you should actually be thinking about. But I don't know. Have you noticed that change in academia?
Well, academia is saturated with propagandists. We've let the resentful radicals in beginning in the 60s, and they've essentially taken over the universities. So is that helpful? No, not in the least. So it's hard to be a good university professor. It's hard to be a good researcher. And it took a long time for the institutions of higher education to be reliable transmitters of both tradition and the spirit of inquiry. It's easily disrupted, and it's disrupted now.
When did you make the commitment to truth and honesty?
In 1985, 1984, yeah. Perfect year for that, 1984.
And why did you do it?
Because I understood at that point, both personally and sociologically, let's say, that lies produce hell.
Was there anything that made you realize that?
Sure. Lots of things. I'd been studying, partly it was a consequence of the study of atrocity, because I'd been studying atrocity really from the time I was 13 onward. Motivation for serious misbehavior, you might say, like sadistic murderousness and the enjoyment that can be derived from that. And the absolute cataclysmic hells that were produced by totalitarian states in the 20th century. How do they come about? Through lies. So when I became thoroughly convinced of that, and if you're thoroughly convinced of that, well, to the point where that appears as a fact, there's an obvious moral conclusion to derive from that. It's like, you want to contribute to hell? Keep on lying.
What was the final straw that broke the camel's back for that? Was a certain book that you read, a personal experience? Because it's very specific.
There's a combination of both. I mean, my life in 1984 was still somewhat dissolute. I liked to drink. And so I had a hedonistic orientation to some degree. And, alcohol doesn't bring out the best in people's characters. Alcohol almost universally makes people less than they are. It's fun because it eradicates your concern for future consequences. It actually kind of does that physiologically, you might say, because alcohol is a potent anxiety-reducing drug. For some people, it's also a psychomotor stimulant like cocaine, and it was certainly that for me. And for other for people too, it can have a heroin-like effect, which facilitates the sense of social belonging. And I think I had all three of those effects from alcohol. So I liked it quite a lot. But the consequence for me was, I would misbehave when I was drinking in ways that made me remorseful the next day or the next 2 days or the next week. And I realized at that point that was a performative contradiction in a sense. Performative contradiction is when you act out something that's a lie, runs contrary to your moral beliefs, right? And so I was looking at the literature on atrocity, trying to determine how the proclivity to bring those states about, those hellish states about, might be ameliorated. Like, what's the opposite of evil? That's the question I suppose I was trying to solve. And so when I saw patterns of behavior in my own life that were making things worse than they had to be, then that was an indication that it was time to stop. And I moved to Montreal after that to go to graduate school, and that was a pretty dramatic transformation in my social milieu. And I started to drop a lot of the things that I was doing that were counterproductive. Took me another 4 years, something like that, to like just stop drinking altogether, stop smoking, to exercise more, to be more disciplined.
Did you find that difficult to do?
Oh, yes. Of course. Yeah. I was very good at drinking.
Good at it?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I suppose, I mean, I was very social. I had a large group of friends. I had a blast.
I had an interesting experience with alcohol, which was I had made the personal decision to completely abstain from it. I was disgusted by it for a really long time, up until being about 21 and a half. And I went to like a party school. Everyone claims it's a party school. This one, there was a lot of drinking, obviously. And then I finally made the decision after I had realized, it's funny. I just remember this right now.
Okay.
I wrestled with the decision to drink because I just thought it made everything worse. Obviously, I thought you're like poisoning and polluting yourself. I thought that it's hurting like your relationship with spirituality, everything. And I remember after all this debate, I went and read your opinion on alcohol. And it actually allowed me, it gave myself permission to drink, which I know sounds exactly the opposite of what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
But you had said it was really only a sin or bad if you do it in excess.
Mm-hmm.
So I finally allowed myself to drink.
Yeah,
and
I didn't like to do it except in excess. So
yeah, well, I soon later found out that that is pretty nice on occasion. Not a recommendation, but I found your opinion on that, and this was after about 1.5 years of honestly, I was suffering a lot. So I was in my head, I was anxious, I couldn't be myself. I felt like I was disassociating in environments, but actually, I drank alcohol, and it brought me into the present for the first time in a very long time. And I think, oddly enough, that was a part of healing, which sounds completely counterproductive and not intuitive at all, but it helped me, oddly enough.
It's like training wheels.
Experience,
I guess,
to experience, like a social environment physically, like you're actually there to experience happiness for the first time in a very long time. I did it with a close friend of mine, but I don't know if that means anything, if there's any significance to that, or, I don't want to be recommending alcohol.
The significance fundamentally is that things are complicated. Like lots of teenagers now don't drink at all. So you might say, well, that's a good thing because alcohol, all things considered, is problematic. But if you're not partying because you have no friends and you're in your basement miserable and depressed, that's not an improvement. No, and so I suppose to some degree, whether or not something is good depends on your starting point. Like I can understand, for example, why so many young men admire Andrew Tate. At least Andrew Tate has all the positive aspects of a successful narcissist. It beats the hell out of being depressed and anxious. Now, is that a stellar goal? No, but it's an improvement over isolated misery. You see this in female mate choices. There's a strong proclivity in women to be enamored of bad boys. And there's a variety of reasons for that. But one reason is, well, they're a hell of a lot more interesting than martyred, miserable, depressed, anxious, self-conscious, low self-esteem non-starters. So now, is that an optimal choice? No. But comparatively, that's the attraction of the shadow figure fundamentally. What did Nietzsche say about morality? Most morality is cowardice. What did he mean by that? Well, he didn't mean that morality was cowardice. He said most morality is cowardice. And what he meant by that was people find themselves too timid to do anything. And so instead of admitting their lack of courage to themselves, they put a moral gloss on it and say that the reason they're timorous is because they're good. That's a form of moral hypocrisy. There were kids in my high school, for example, who never drank. they were good kids, but they weren't good. They're just cowards. That wasn't helpful. Now, my delinquent friends in junior high and high school, a lot of them became alcoholics. So their lack of cowardice on the exploration front also caused them a tremendous amount of misery. Look, there's actually a literature on this. So imagine you took adolescents and on a distribution of rule breaking. Okay. There's kids who never break any rules on one end, and there's kids who break them all the time on the other end. And then there's the kids in the middle who experiment with rule breaking in adolescence. Well, the ones who never break rules are at much higher risk for depression, anxiety, and dependent personality disorder later in life. They're too inhibited. And the ones who break rules all the time, well, they end up in prison. So you want to have that. I'm not saying that you should be in the middle exactly. I'm saying that there's a optimal mode of being that allows you to explore, even in ways that could potentially be destructive, and that's the best pathway to facilitate development.
It's like 12 rules. It's the order and chaos. It's walking the line between what's familiar and known versus exploring something.
Because you don't want to make the error of presuming that a totalitarian order is equivalent to morality.
It's funny, what you said was actually exactly the conclusion that I had came to, which was I was assigning a false sense of morality to myself because I was sober. Even though it just made me feel good about myself. Because I thought that I was, holier than thou.
Yeah, right.
Because I wasn't drinking and I was denying myself that because other people would say that, like people that cared about me, but I wouldn't actually accept it. And it was out of cowardice.
It's interesting how alcohol affects everybody differently, because for me, it puts me to sleep. I'll have 2 drinks and instantly I'm just like, all right, I'm tired. This isn't fun. I'm not enjoying myself.
So
for some people, it's an accelerant.
Stimulant effect.
No, it's
same here.
We tested people in the lab in Montreal. You give them 3 drinks in 20 minutes, so a pretty decent dose. Their heart rate would go up 40 beats per minute. It was just like a shot of cocaine. And those were often people who had a history of familial alcoholism, so they had a genetic predisposition to be alcoholic, but they were getting a psychomotor stimulant kick. And it looks like that was opiate mediated. So for some people, when they drink, they produce a lot of beta endorphin, which is an opiate. It's in the opiate family. And so there's endless benefit to that. I had a friend in Montreal, an old guy, Frank Irvin. He was a cool old guy, looked like Ernest Hemingway. I liked Frank a lot. He had a monkey farm on St. Kitts, vervet monkeys, and him and his wife, Roberta Palmer, who was also very cool. They ran an alcohol lab for years, and they gave these vervet monkeys free access to rum and coke, and 5% of them would drink Tacoma on first exposure. It was funny. They had videos of that, and it's like a frat party. It's very funny to watch these drunk monkeys, but 95% of them wouldn't drink Tacoma, right? They'd have a bit and stop, but 5% of them would. It was like, where have you been all my life? Like Barney Gumble on The Simpsons, So alcohol is a great drug for some people. It wasn't for you.
Yeah. It's just a natural disposition to either being accelerated while you're taking alcohol or being, I guess, slowed down.
If you're very fortunate, let's say, and you really want to become an alcoholic, it would be good to be susceptible to the anxiety reduction element and the psychomotor stimulant element and the opiate element. And then, hooray, it's a very good drug, except it makes you stupid. That's also the part of the problem with being hedonistically oriented. It's short-term gratification. It's like, well, that's fine, but what do you pay for it?
Yeah. That was one of the reasons too why I completely stopped drinking, is because the more successful I got, the bigger the price I had to pay. Like taking half a day off became so valuable that I thought to myself, do I want to pass that up for 2 drinks? Or would I rather just not have the 2?
Well, that was another thing that also convinced me to stop drinking is when I was working on my first book, I couldn't. First of all, it was too emotionally demanding to work on when I was hungover. Like I just couldn't handle it. It was just too much because, reading about sadistic Auschwitz guards is rather disturbing at the best of times. And if you're royally hungover, it's much worse. And also I couldn't edit because I couldn't think clearly. And, one of the things, so here's something to consider. So in the biblical stories of transformation, the story of Abraham's a good example of that. So Abraham leaves the confines of his family. He's from a wealthy family. He leaves the comfort and the confines of his family. He goes out into the world. God comes to him as the spirit of adventure. And then Abraham goes through a series of transformations of personality. His name is actually Abram to begin with, Abram. He's renamed about 2/3 of the way through the story. And the reason for that is that his identity transforms so radically that it's as if he's a new person. Okay, so what does he do? Well, he starts aiming up, and then his personality transforms. He has to make a sacrifice. So he builds an altar and he makes a sacrifice. Well, what's the sacrifice? Well, you just said what the sacrifice is. You jumped up a rung in terms of the field of opportunity and responsibility that was in front of you, and you thought, oh, my time's too valuable to waste half a day. Well, that also happened to me in graduate school. It's like, no, I can't afford this anymore.
Yeah.
And it's not even I couldn't afford it. It's like, I have something better to do. This is something that anybody who's watching and listening, for example, if you want to deal with an addiction, it's one thing to quit. Quitting doesn't exactly work. You have to replace it with something better. And if alcohol's great or if cocaine's great for you, it's like, well, what could be better? Well, that's your problem fundamentally. But, you said, well, you discovered that your time was valuable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it's better I certainly came to that conclusion in graduate school. It's like, no, what I'm working on is so interesting that I don't want to compromise it even a little bit. So imagine that you move up these rungs, that's Jacob's ladder, by the way, up these rungs of transformation. With every major transition, there's going to be a sacrifice.
Yeah, I think over time, too, that's why it became more disagreeable. It's just because your time is so valuable that you know what you need to focus on, and you tend to put down other things.
Yes, definitely. That's a matter. Sure. That's one of the advantages actually to being disagreeable is that you can prioritize more stringently.
Right.
And, that as a virtue, that's got a bad rap in our culture because you're supposed to be agreeable all the time. You're not supposed to discriminate. You're not supposed to judge. It's like, really? You're not supposed to discriminate. So everything's the same, is it? That's how you're going to organize your life. There's nothing that distinguishes that from utter chaos. You have to be unbelievably discriminating. That's the logos, right? So when God throws Adam and Eve out of paradise, or when they actually fall out of paradise because of their pride, which is a more accurate way of representing it, God installs a cherubim, which is a kind of a monstrous angel, and a sword that's on fire that turns every which way. And what does that mean? Well, it means that a sword obviously cuts, and a flaming sword burns. And so a flaming sword cuts and burns. And if it turns every which way, there's no escaping it. Well, why? Well, if you want to regain paradise, then everything that isn't appropriate has to be cut and burned away. And that can be a lot. So people are terrified of that. Like I've read metaphysical speculations that hell, there's no difference between hell for the sinful and the sight of the sword that cuts and burns everything away. Because if you're 95% lies, then anything that fixes you would look like death or worse. And so the terrifying ideal that destroys everything about you that's not worthy, that's rough. Well, you experience that at least to some degree with regards to your conclusions about drinking. Yeah. And this is the case, so I never drink now. So what happened to me is I quit when I was about 27. It took me a while. And then I quit till I was about 50. And part of the reason I quit too was because I was having kids and there was no way I was going to be drunk around my kids. Like, no, that wasn't going to happen. And then my kids left and I was 50 and I thought, well, maybe I could have a drink or two and see, because it's kind of a pain to, in a way, socially, to never have a glass of wine. Now I don't care. But then, there was still some awkwardness about that. And I don't know, some curiosity. So I drank a bit when I was around 50 and I thought I was just stupid at 50 as I was when I was 27. I'd have 2 or 3 drinks and then it was, all right, man, we're off to the races, and so I just stopped again. Now there's just no question about it because I can't afford ever to make a mistake.
Yeah.
So
one thing I'm always curious about is I feel like everyone experiences life in terms of colors. And some people's colors just happen to be more vibrant than others. So for example, if I think I'm happy, if I think I'm as happy as I can possibly be, I'm a 10 out of 10, or I would say like I have 10 out of 10 joy. What if that someone else is just 6 out of 10? And what if
you do see that with temperamental variation. I mean, positive emotion can keep spiraling upward till it hits mania. Like there's an upper limit because at it's complicated. But if we just talk about positive emotion per se, not about meaning, let's say, just positive emotion. As you move up the scale of positive emotion, it gets more and more intense, but it limits out into pathology. So manics are very happy.
But meaning produces positive emotion. Meaning is positive,
that's
right?
complicated. No, not exactly. It's complicated because sometimes meaning can produce misery, especially in the short term. That happens with kids all the time. Look, there's a huge psychological literature that purports to show that couples without children are happier than couples with children. So then you think, well, children are a burden. No, your definition of quality in life is stupid. It's like, of course you're not happy if you have children. It's like you're worried about them. Why? Because they might die. Or be hurt. So that's on your mind. But that doesn't mean that it's not meaningful. Right? And so in a very profound way, you have to snap the connection between hedonism, either on the positive or negative emotion scale, and meaning. Like the relationship is by no means one-to-one. So let me give you an example. So in Notes from Underground, Dostoevsky put forward a very trenchant criticism of utopian socialism, and purposefully so, because that was one of Dostoevsky's prime focuses of contemplation. And he said that if you provided people with all of the hedonic delights that they would want, and you put them in a situation where that was provided to them continually, all they would do is smash that up so that something strange and mysterious and unpredictable would happen, because we have this requirement for what? Suffering? Maybe. How about the suffering that forces you to develop? Is that an instinctual demand? Probably. People will pick false adventure over no adventure. Like, we're wired for trouble, for sure, to seek it out. People are caused trouble all the time, especially when they don't have anything vital to do. In fact, that is what they'll do, is cause trouble, because that's a false adventure.
It's hard to imagine that the highest quality of life does not produce the highest average positive emotion.
I'm not sure about that. I don't know if that's optimal. Like, if you're listening to music, the happiest music is elevator music. It's just happy. Like, it's trivial, but that's the thing. Like, there's a lack of depth to unadulterated happiness.
But the depth provides positive emotion.
Right, but the depth also is associated with suffering. You've apprehended this to some degree because you said that the notion of a call to responsibility was attractive to you. Well, that's a burden. Responsibility is a burden. There's a weight to it. Now, you might say, what did Nietzsche say? He who has a why can bear any how. You could say, well, if the purpose is sufficiently noble, the weight is irrelevant. That's a better way of conceptualizing it, I think. And I think that's right. So you want to have a orientation towards your life and the world that makes even the suffering, no, it's not just justifiable. Welcome.
Well, couldn't that just be meaning? Feeling like you have...
What do you mean, just?
Uh-oh, Graham. Just meaning?
It's having meaning. It's having purpose. It's feeling important and needing to be somewhere for something that I think is greater than yourself.
Yes. Well, that's also part of the sacrificial element of maturity. So one of the things I've got in trouble for saying, which is true anyways, is that you don't grow up till you have kids. And people who don't have kids, who think they're growing up, take exception to that. And I can understand why, but I don't really care, because you're not mature until someone matters more than you do. And that, unless there's something wrong with you, like seriously wrong, and that happens to people, if you have kids, that will happen to you. And you might say you could be committed to something else with equal intensity. It's like, yeah, maybe. I doubt it, but maybe. There might be one person in 1,000 who's capable of taking on a burden that's equivalent, let's say, to care for a child in some other form, care for an ailing relative, for example, or a sibling, or maybe even sacrificial love for a husband or a wife. Very rare. Very rare.
What maturity does that give you to have children?
He got married recently, so he's, thinking about the idea of it.
Well, you're responsible. They're obviously fragile in a very fundamental way, and that's your problem. So you better have your eyes open. And there's lots of ways you can foul up. And the thing about kids, they're perfect. And you can really muck that up. Now, you can also encourage their development and facilitate the maintenance of that sort of paradisal quality of being. You want to do that within the confines of your house. And that's great. Like my experience with children was they certainly, I like children. I used to work in daycares when I was like 18. I really liked little kids. And so I never felt my kids to be a burden. When I was working as a professor at Harvard, I basically stripped my life down to work and my family. That was it. There was nothing else. And that was fine. I loved my work, and so that was fine. But my family was a very good break from my work and very rewarding. Most of the time, if I had my choice, I'd rather hang around with my kids. That's been the case my whole life. It's still the case now. They're unbelievably rewarding. So the thing about kids, this is something that's very useful to know. The relationship you have with your child will be the only relationship you ever have in your life that starts with the following presumption. There's nothing that child wants more than to have the best possible relationship with you. They 100% want that. That's right on the table for you. Now people find that daunting and they're afraid of it, and no wonder, but it's an unbelievably high quality relationship.
How does it bring you maturity though?
Because you're contending with their fragility, there's errors the consequence of your errors are radically multiplied.
Okay.
Right. And it's not just you that's on the hook for your stupidity. It's your kids, and they're not responsible for your stupidity. You might be, but, so if you conduct yourself in a manner that makes them suffer, well, then you're contributing to the suffering of the innocent, that's for sure. And so, you become aware of that. And that, part of your question has to be answered in part by discussing what it means to be mature. The more forward-looking you are, the more mature you are. The more your actions in the present are bound by the future. That's one definition of maturity. So even in relationship to yourself, well, why not drink and have fun? Well, how about because there's tomorrow? Mm-hmm. Right. Or your career.
Right.
Or you're at a fairly high level of attainment and you do something foolish when you're drunk. It might even just be a word that's spoken improperly or carelessly. It's like it damages your reputation because people are expecting more from you than that. And if you violate that, then all sorts of doors that you didn't even know were there slam shut. And so you're orienting yourself to a longer view of life. That's partly what Christ is referring to when he talks about life eternal. You start to view your life not as the moment-to-moment happening, but the entire pattern, perhaps not only across the span of your life, but like a multi-generational span. And then the other element of maturity is that it's not about you. Like it's partly about you, but it's just as much about your wife, and it's just as much about your kids and then your community, right? So instead of you being focused on self-centered gratification in the immediate present, you're looking more for something like harmony on the social front. So you and your wife are getting along, right? There's a harmony established. Then your kids and your wife and you are getting along, and that's a harmony. That's a much better view also of mental health. One of the disservices that the psychological and psychiatric community have done in the last 100 years is imbue people with the conviction that mental health is something that's in your head and that's yours. That's complete bloody nonsense. That isn't how it works at all. Like, you can't be mentally healthy if your wife is miserable. Well, that's not in your head. Your stability is dependent on the harmony of your social surround, and it's dependent on the integration of the present with the future. And the more mature you are, the better you are at taking all that into account at every moment. So, and there's a strange thing that goes along with that. So in the Sermon on the Mount, for example, which is a series of instructions, by the way. So Christ tells his followers, first of all, to aim up. And so you could think of that ultimately, and the ultimate expression of that would be something like your attempt to establish a relationship with the transcendent or the divine. It's a difficult thing to define, but you can think about it more prosaically as well, which is, well, if you can think of something better that you could be doing practically in any of the dimensions of life that you're exploring, aim at that. You might say, well, I don't know what the ultimate pinnacle of goodness is. It's like, fair enough, but there's some proximal goods that you're probably aware of. Like one of the questions people can generally answer is, well, what stupid things are you doing to muck up your life that you know about, that you could quit doing, that you would quit doing? It might be a short list, but it's something. It's like, well, there's an upward orientation there. That upward orientation can magnify as it's practiced. And that's part of the establishment of a religious mode of being. Anyways, you orient yourself upwards, right? Then you assume that other people have the same intrinsic value that you do. And then you concentrate on the moment. And then you can have your cake and eat it too, because you get the pleasure of being immersed in the moment. And there isn't anything in some sense that's a deeper source of meaning than that. But that's predicated on the proper distal orientation, right? So Christ says in the Sermon on the Mount that you should be like the lilies of the field, right? That they don't toil and they don't spin. They're not Machiavellian. They're not Machiavellian in their orientation. They're not always trying to twist the fabric of reality so they get what they want. It's like, no, aim up, then concentrate on the moment. And that those things should inform each other. You could imagine, here's an example of that. So you could imagine appearing on a podcast with Machiavellian intent to sell something, for example. Or you could imagine following the thread of the conversation wherever it goes, assuming that the goal is to have the most engaging conversation possible. Those are very different orientations. If your orientation is towards engagement in the conversation, and you set that frame, then you can concentrate on the moment and look for the opportunities that make themselves manifest in relationship to that goal. And you can do that always in your life, constantly. That's what a religious practice is for, so that you're doing that in every moment. Technically, that's what it's for. And that's way different than a hedonic motivation. They're not the same thing at all.
You mentioned that you cannot be healthy in the absence of a long-term, stable relationship.
Yeah, and you can't regulate your own behavior.
And eventually, short-term relationships will turn you Machiavellian, sociopathic, and potentially narcissistic.
Well, it depends on why you're pursuing them. Like, look, the data on this is crystal clear. There's no debate about this among serious psychologists, let's say. So there are two patterns of successful mating, let's say. Successful pursuit of sexual gratification. There's the mosquito model and the human model. The mosquito model is plenty of offspring, no investment. The human model is very small number of offspring, very high investment. Okay, so now take the humans. Now there's a distribution of humans. Some of them are low investment maters and some of them are high investment maters. So low investment would be many offspring, no investment. Okay, now you say, that's a strategy. It's a biological strategy. Okay, who are the people who utilize that strategy? They're Machiavellian, narcissistic, psychopathic, and sadistic. So, if that's what you want, and if you're naturally like that, that will be your orientation. But if you practice that, that's also what you'll become.
For a long-term healthy and stable relationship, does that have to be with like a partner, like a husband or wife or a spouse? Or could it be, say, a brother or
that's
a child?
Better than nothing. There's all sorts
but
of
just something to contend
that
with that will always keep you in check is essentially what you're saying.
Well, it's something to care for over the long run that isn't you.
Couldn't that also be, let's say, a sibling or a close friend?
Sure.
But it's just not as
we have these other
optimal
relationships, but there isn't the advantage to long-term heterosexual child-centered coupling is that it provides all those other benefits. There's a polarity between men and women that's important, a fundamental orientation that's important. If you can bring both of those viewpoints to any given situation, in all likelihood, that's more advantageous. That provides a platform for children and grandchildren, so the continuity of humanity across the generations. And the core of that's obviously the relationship between men and women. Are there ways of approximating that? Well, obviously, but they're approximations. And that doesn't mean, obviously, there are some people who have better friendships than their marriage, but that's irrelevant with regards to the main point, because we're talking about something that's an ideal. Everybody falls short of the ideal. But part of the reason you can't maintain sanity isn't in your head. Like, here's a definition of sanity. You're well enough socialized so other people can tell you when you're an idiot and you'll listen. So why is that a good solution? Well, there's a lot of other people. And if they're giving you signals all the time, all you have to do is listen. So that's a good deal for you. Now, you might think, well, that's, sanity's in my head. It's like, what makes you think you can regulate yourself? You're pretty goddamn complicated, So we regulate ourselves socially. That's why we talk to each other. It's vital.
That's so interesting. I feel like, once again, what you're saying, I feel like I'm like struck with my pride a little bit. Like, I feel like I can regulate myself. I can always aim up or try to do what is right and think, well, I guess I'm still basing my decision making, because a heuristic I use a lot of the time when I'm trying to decide what to do between like a moral conundrum is like, what would the optimal person in this situation do? And completely remove myself from this situation. And then I do that. But I guess that's also relating.
Well, that's right.
Yeah,
that's
being
what you've
impressed
done.
upon
Well,
by
that's right. What you've done to some, that's a good observation. What you've done to some degree is you've constructed an idealized representation of another, or a human being for that matter. That's like the Son of Man in the Christian conception. That's a good way of thinking about it. So what you're doing when you do that is no different from what, say, evangelical Christians do when they ask themselves, what would Jesus do? It's exactly the same thing.
And it's pulled from real people. It's just certain components about them. So they're still technically impressing upon me.
Yeah. You're essentially fabricating out of whole cloth something approximating a classic religious orientation. What would someone who is ideal do in this situation? Well, see, if you delved into that, this is where the religious investigation would take place. It's like, okay, who is this ideal that you're calling upon? What's the characterization of that ideal? You could write that all down. You'd see what your ideal is. And then you'd see that it approximates the figure of the hero in mythology, insofar as it has any utility to you.
I told my friend this, and he said, that is the start of religion, or that is God to people, which...
Yeah, well, that's the intermediary figure in some ways. So there's the transcendent ultimate unity, let's say, but that's ineffable. It's difficult to establish a relationship with. There's some intermediary figure. That's the role that Christ plays in Christianity, right? That's God brought down to earth. Why is Christ an ideal? Because he welcomes the catastrophe of fate. Right. And so there's no ideal person who doesn't do that. I mean, James Bond does that. Like, well, seriously, like anybody that attracts your admiration is going to have that welcoming attitude towards even the difficulties of existence. Like, that's going to be a stellar part of their character. Otherwise, you wouldn't admire them. You admire people who can maintain themselves across a catastrophe. Right. So the most admirable person is the person who can maintain themselves the best across the worst possible catastrophe. Right. And so that'll be lurking at the back of the ideal.
So welcoming suffering and welcoming the catastrophe reminds me of Man's Search for Meaning, which for me was one of the most important books I've ever read. And he also quoted a man who has a why can bear almost any how. Right. Which is what you quoted earlier, which is really interesting. Are there any other books or authors where if you were to tell the viewers right now, if they started listening to them or reading them, that would make one of the biggest impacts that they can possibly?
Well, that's a good one. Modern Man's Search for a Soul. That's Jung's book. That's a very good book. The Gulag Archipelago is like Viktor Frankl on steroids.
Yeah.
But it's a voyage, that book. Frankl's book has the advantage of being pretty accessible. It's accessible, but it's profound. It's relatively short. So that's a pretty good deal. Notes from Underground, anything Dostoevsky wrote. Beyond Good and Evil, although that's a rough one. That's hard on people, that book. But Viktor Frankl's book is singular in some ways in the popular literature because of its combination of depth and accessibility. So
I read Crime and Punishment because of you. And I had never, this was the first book I've ever read of that type that was so deep. And it's interesting because now it reminds me of the conversation we had earlier where the emotions that they can bring out in the reader are so gut-wrenching. And it's like pain, but it's positive and negative at the exact same time.
That's right.
And
just like classical music, great classical music.
But it was a whole different set of emotions I feel like I hadn't experienced before. And I found that interesting because I guess overall, there was a lot of meaning in the book.
Right.
And it brought about, a different experience of life I hadn't previously experienced. But at the same time, it was the contending of like the positive and negative emotions. And also, I mean, the way that Dostoevsky can write is so descriptive and accurate.
Well, it's also a great adventure story, a great thriller, great crime novel. It's an amazing book.
What are your thoughts on Eckhart Tolle?
I don't know enough about him really to comment in depth. I mean, Eckhart Tolle is part of that 1960s humanist movement, essentially. And fundamentally, the humanists were wrong. So that would go along with, say, conceptions like self-actualization. That would be Abraham Maslow. And what did Carl Rogers describe it as? Something like the fully functional person, the person whose actions are commensurate with their utterances, who's transparent to themselves and others, who communicates in a manner that's striving to bring themselves and other people upward. But it's all within a humanist framework. And it's that in the final analysis, that's it's weak. It can't withstand ideological assault with any degree of resistance.
I found Eckhart Tolle to be, I mean, his two books were also some of the most important books I've ever read. A New Earth and The Power of Now. Both of those made tremendous differences. A lot of it has to do, the fundamental idea of those books is very similar to what a lot of different philosophers say. A lot of philosophers, when you boil it down, I'm sure you know that the fundamentals are pretty much the same. It's just the abstractions from it differ. I feel like I'm sure you've observed that. But I think those two books were some of the most important things for me, at least to use as tools to alleviate.
I learned a lot from the humanists when, like Rogers and Maslow, for example, when I read them when I was, I don't know, something approximating. How old are you?
25.
25. So a little, how old are you?
34.
34. I read them when I was a little younger than you, and I learned a lot from Rogers and from Maslow. So, the effect that a book has on you depends to some non-trivial degree on where you happen to be standing when you encounter the book. And if the person who's writing the book knows much more than you do about something at that moment, well, then the book can be very enlightening. And lots of books, like I learned a lot from Freud. I think Freud was fundamentally wrong in his insistence that it was the hedonic element that drove life itself. He used the sexual impulse as a stand-in for hedonic orientation. I just don't think that's true, but I still learned a lot from reading Freud. Lots of thinkers can be wrong in some ways and right in others, and a discriminating reader pulls out the wheat and leaves the chaff behind. I learned a lot from Ernest Becker's book, The Denial of Death, which is sort of the ultimate extension of the Freudian view. It's a brilliant book. It's wrong, but it's brilliant, and there's much in it that's correct. Fundamentally, it's wrong because Becker believed that the heroic orientation in life was also a form of defense against death anxiety. That's not, it's a good theory. It's an interesting theory. Sometimes it's true, but fundamentally it's wrong.
You wrote in your book about growing up and living a very poor life, at least financially speaking, and that you were an assistant professor supporting a family. And your wife, Tammy, had no green card, so she couldn't work. And you have a funny story about selling a neighbor a car, and then the door fell off on the car after you sold it.
We had quite the rat trap of an old car, that's for sure. I think I spray painted it because it was so... all the paint had peeled off in the sun in Saskatchewan. It was enough of a rattle trap to attract the attention of police. So
oh, no.
I spray painted it in the...
It works, though.
Well, it worked until we had enough capital to get another car. But yeah, we pretty much drove that thing right into the ground.
But now,
It's like the worst car ever too. 1975 Ford Granada. Everything about that car was bad.
you wouldn't recommend it if someone's looking for a new car.
I think it had a 400 cubic inch engine and no power. It's like, I don't know how Ford managed to have a huge V8 in a 2-door that had like no acceleration and no high speed. It had no room in it, even though it was a huge car. Yeah. It had no room in the back seat, even though it was a huge car. It was really not a good car.
So how has acquiring wealth, going from that to where you are today, affected your family, beliefs, and the way you see life?
Well, for me mostly, and I think for my family mostly, like, you have to define wealth in a way, and wealth is a plethora of opportunity. And so, yeah, I have a plethora of opportunity in every possible direction. So that's great. What difference has it made to my day-to-day life? Well, I have more houses. It hasn't made much difference because I already pretty much had everything I wanted, and I'm not particularly interested in the hedonistic end of what wealth might hypothetically bring to you. I was pretty old when all of this blew up around me. And so, but mostly it's just a wealth of opportunity. That's wealth, is a wealth of opportunity.
Have you always been like that in terms of not pursuing things, or did that just occur with age?
Well, I pursue things to some degree. I mean, I have a big art collection, but that's a form of exploration for me. Most of the art that I collected was propaganda from the Soviet Union, and I was very interested in that historically and also aesthetically, because propaganda art is a weird blend, right? It's a blend of falsehood and truth, a very strange blend. And so it was very interesting to see these paintings, especially the ones that were done by people with great skill. And, it was part of my investigation into the structure of totalitarianism per se. So I bought a lot of paintings, and that was very entertaining. But I did that before everything blew up around me. And so I did that on, a normal level of income, let's say.
Yeah.
How are you able to keep your ego in check with, what's happened over the past decade, just absolutely blowing up and becoming, famous, essentially, acquiring wealth?
I read a paper a long time ago called Relations Between the Ego and the Unconscious, which is written by Carl Jung. And it's a great paper, but no one can understand it unless they know what it's about. It's about that problem. So I talk about archetypal matters, right? And that has produced a focus of attention on my work. Well, that's not me. You have to make sure that you don't confuse yourself with the truth, let's say, like in a personal manner. So the fact that I can explain, let's say, the Enuma Elish, which is a Mesopotamian creation myth, doesn't mean that I figured it out. I didn't create the story. So you have to distinguish yourself from the effect that the ideas have. You don't want to take credit for that. Partly because it's extreme. First of all, it won't work. You will definitely crash and burn if you do that. 100%. That's the story of Icarus. You don't want to do that. You don't want to fly too close to the sun and have the heat melt all the wax in your wings. That's a very bad idea. And then I have people around me. I have good counselors. My wife, very level-headed. My son and my daughter are awake and they keep an eye on things. And I have friends too that play the same role. So we're evaluating and watching all the time, trying to be careful. And I try to be careful. And remember too, to be grateful for all the opportunities that I have and for the fact that people aren't throwing stones at me, which they easily could be.
I think gratitude is definitely a formidable opponent for an ego.
Definitely.
Yeah. And then obviously also having some people to keep you grounded, some people that you trust.
Yeah, right. Well, that's part of that distribution of sanity. It's like if you have a complex situation, you're going to need a number of people around you to evaluate and investigate and make the way forward. And so, I'm fortunate too that I worked with my wife and we figured out how to work very closely together. And she has a cardinal role to play, and I work with my kids, and that works out very well. And so we're constantly communicating about how to negotiate what's in front of us.
What would you say is your biggest insecurity?
My biggest insecurity. Well, it's probably related to the question that you asked. It's like, how do you keep your feet on the ground? And I'm constantly reminding myself how fortunate I am. My wife almost died. That was quite the catastrophe. I was extremely ill for 3 years in an unbelievable amount of pain. That's gone. People, I'm traveling all around the world and people are pleased to see me. I don't take that for granted. I'm very careful with people. I don't presume that that's normal or ordinary, ever, because it's not. I remind myself before I go on stage that I'm lucky to be there, lucky to be alive, lucky that it's not a mad mob, because it easily could be. So gratitude is an antidote to resentment and arrogance.
What would you say your biggest weakness is?
Talk too much. Maybe.
Do you see any reason to fix that? Do you see
Well, I
is
try
that
to
a
fix
weakness?
it.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. It's a strength with some potential temptations. In the podcasts, I still probably don't have my podcasts optimized. I still talk probably more than I should in my podcasts, but I've always talked more than I should ever since I was like 2. So and there's obviously advantages in it because I'm very verbally fluent, and that fact has enabled what I've done. And so, everything can be carried to excess. I'm good at listening when I remember to listen. And I like to listen. I'm very interested in people. And so, that makes it easy for podcasts.
But it's more of a conscious effort. Because I feel like I've observed a couple times in this podcast where you've noticed your string of conversation and then you kind of think about it for a second and then you're like, okay, I should come to a resolve or something. Or would you say that isn't what happened?
Well, when I'm speaking, I'm paying attention to how the words are landing.
Yeah.
Which is something that people can learn to do. It's a very useful thing to learn to do. You can watch and you can see if what you're saying makes you stronger or weaker. And you can more or less feel that with every word. And you can learn to put your foot down where the ground is solid. And that's unbelievably useful. That's what I'm doing all the time that I'm speaking. It's like, where's the next bit of solid ground? Now, I can get carried away with enthusiasm. And then I remind myself to look more.
Are you afraid of death?
I'm afraid of other things more.
Why? Because death to me just seems like there's nothing that we can confirm in terms of an afterlife. So to me, that seems terrifying. Like I would be more worried about that than other things.
I don't think about that ever really, because it's beyond my capacity of comprehension. So I just leave that lie fundamentally. But if death is the thing you're most afraid of, you're very fortunate. So there are things that are far worse than death, like far worse. So, I would say I've experienced a fair number of those. So
what would you say is worse?
Unbearable pain that doesn't go away.
Yeah.
Moral culpability. Like how much do you want to be responsible for the suffering that your stupidity has engendered? So that's rough. So that's why there's conceptualizations of the soul, let's say, in classic religious writings. You strive to protect not your life, but your soul. And that's right. And it's hard for modern people to understand that because modern people think that there's no fear worse than the fear of death. But that's just because they lack imagination. So if you have enough imagination, this is why the terror management theorists, for example, are wrong. We construct our beliefs to protect us against death anxiety. It's like if the thing you're most worried about is your own demise, then you haven't delved very far down the rungs of Dante's Inferno, because there's things that are much worse than death. So that's why sometimes people regard death as a relief.
We had a discussion before this podcast about responsibility of having a voice that people listen to, the responsibility of having a podcast. Do you ever worry, because this is always a worry of ours, if we bring someone on our show and we can't contend with their points, if they have something, if they're a really good rhetorician,
Yeah.
and we just, even if we have the facts, we can't relay them in such a way that trumps whatever rhetoric they can spew.
Yeah.
Is that a responsibility that we then owe to our viewer and the people around us to not bring that person
You have the
on?
responsibility to do the best you can, to get your orientation right, to do the best you can. It doesn't hurt people to see you, put back on your heels or struggling in the face of a particularly well-designed manipulative onslaught. That happens to everybody. I'm concerned about that. I have guests now and then, very rarely, because I pick my guests very carefully, but I've had guests that I regretted having, for example, because the conversation, I couldn't stop the conversation from degenerating into an argument. I'm not interested in the game of who's right. It's such a dull game. I quit playing that game like in 1986. It's like, you're right. Go have it your way, So I don't like conversations that degenerate into arguments, and the sort of situation that you're describing, where you have a guest that's particularly good with rhetorical flourishes, it can degenerate into an argument about who's right. Primate dominance, hierarchy maneuvering. It's dull. But, there's no reason that you have to do your podcast perfectly. You know what I mean? You want to be on the edge.
We like to think
risks.
that we bear some sort of responsibility if we have someone on our channel that, in essence, whether or not we agree, we are platforming them. Or we are giving them...
I don't agree with that.
Well, my sense of that, my experience of that has been that if you do what you can to explore and investigate, and you're trying to maintain an orientation towards truth, that the audience will sort that out. You have to give, you're not in the business of protecting your audience, right? You're in the business of conducting your investigation and letting them come along for the ride. And you have to assume as a default that when people see, most of them, when the evidence is in front of them, many people can see. The ones that can't, well, if you're trying to educate people, you're trying to deal with that problem too. So you follow the golden thread, and you assume that if you lay out the truth, that the best that could happen happens. And you don't want to get to the point where you're pulling your punches or confining yourself. You can make some mistakes in your exploration, Otherwise, if you're not making some mistakes, you're probably not pushing hard enough. There's an optimal level of error too.
It is a relief to see what happens when you take not going to win the argument, going for truth and clarity to the nth degree, because I see you, which I assume to be, someone in pursuit of that, to be successful and loved, granted, not without its downfalls and shortcomings of
there aren't any real downfalls or shortcomings, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, if you looked at my life in the virtual sense, you'd think I was beset by enemies all the time. But first of all, it isn't obvious that the number of people who should object to you is zero, the optimal number. Like if I'm upsetting totalitarian fascists, it's like, okay, that's a good thing as far as I'm concerned. And also the disconnect between that online, let's say it in my real life, is absolutely staggering. Like I knock on wood, and I don't take this for granted, and I'm also careful about it, but all the interactions I have with people in my actual life are ridiculously positive. It's weird because wherever I go, and it's literally wherever I go, I'm surrounded by friends. And so that's a stunningly good deal. And there's noisy radicals who think they object to things I say. It's whatever. It's a pain. I mean, I'm being persecuted by my college in Canada. I guess the Supreme Court decision for that comes down this week, and I suspect they'll find against me and have me pay the court costs of the college. That's my guess. But, how do I feel about that? I don't know. Maybe it's an opportunity, right? Dragons guard treasure. Right. So if a dragon shows up, you might be thinking, treasure around here somewhere if I was smart enough to see it. And that's a good thing to know. That's a seriously good thing to know. It might be invariably true. It might even be true when it's really quite something quite monstrous and awful staring you in the face. So if they do find against me and the college moves me to re-education, which is the next step, I have no idea what will happen as a consequence of that. And in some ways I don't care, like in a detached way. It's like I'm not that thrilled about being a psychologist at the moment anyways, because my colleagues, by and large, have proved themselves to be contemptibly weak in the face of adversity. It's not really a club I'm that thrilled to be part of. I don't depend on my clinical license for my income, and they're not really going to be able to damage my reputation. So they could cost me some money, but whatever.
Yeah.
I can figure out a way to generate more money from what they're doing than they'll cost me.
So what course would you say you're most excited for?
Well, of the courses I've taught, the Sermon on the Mount, I would say. Yeah, that's a deadly course. So I did a course on Nietzsche. That was fun. It's half of Beyond Good and Evil. I'll do the other half at a different time. But the Sermon on the Mount will be released relatively soon. And that was great fun because it's a wonderful bit of literature to take apart. So, and it is an instruction manual, and it's an extremely useful instruction manual. So it was very fun to go through that. If you're teaching and you're genuinely teaching, you're learning when you teach. And that's also the case with the lectures. And I think all the people who are lecturing for Peterson Academy are doing that. And I'm in a fortunate position because I can identify top level lecturers and thinkers everywhere. And almost invariably when we reach out to them, they say yes. So that's a really good deal. I'm sure you experienced that to some degree with your podcast as your success is mounted. The probability that people will say yes increases. And there's a lot of disenchantment, especially among the great professors, with the current state of our educational institutions. And so we offer them a pretty good deal. It's like, okay, here's the deal. Come to our studio. We'll find an audience of people who actually want to hear what you have to say. That's why they're there. And then you can teach whatever you want at the highest level that you're capable of, and we'll pay you better than you'll be paid by your university, and it'll be better than a book deal, and you'll be able to teach more people. And we'll treat you extremely well while you're there. Well, that's a good deal. And so people come down there and they're very happy because they're treated well and they want to come back. And so Larry Arnn from Hillsdale taught a course on Churchill, which I think is really funny because, are you already going to find a course on Churchill at the typical university? I don't think so. We had one of the members of the Houses of Lords teach a course on great leaders in history. That's just not happening at the universities because nobody buys the great leader of history theory anymore. Resentful, bloody Luciferian intellects.
It'll be interesting to see what professors will do, exceptional professors, when given free rein, to talk about whatever they like to talk about.
Well, that is what you want to see. That's what they're doing when they're teaching.
Bureaucracy and politics that comes with being in a university.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that it's done for me is, so when I used to teach my personality course, I would cover Freud in like an hour and a half. Well, that's not helpful. I mean, I can understand why it's a survey course and all that, but I was going to do a course on Piaget, Jean Piaget, the developmental psychologist, and several other thinkers. But the course just ended up being about Piaget because I had 8 hours and I could just talk about Piaget. So it's quite deep and I can just endlessly do that. And so that's a great opportunity. It's such fun. And if you're lecturing properly, like a lecture isn't the deliverance of knowledge to the empty shells of the recipients. What you're doing properly if you're lecturing is learning. So with the course on Nietzsche, for example, I did the same thing with the Sermon on the Mount. I'd read a section and then actively think about it. It wasn't like I was prepared because I'd been preparing for 40 years, but I didn't have the notes at hand. I wanted the revelations of the meaning to strike me in the moment. That's part of that utility of that ability to concentrate on the moment if your orientation is right. So what's the goal? You walk on a stage for a lecture, you think, okay, well, I'm trying to answer an interesting question with the Sermon on the Mount, it would be, well, what's the essential message of the Sermon on the Mount? That's a hard question. It's a central, what would you say? It's a foundational document of the West. And so, well, what is it? What does it mean? Well, let's find out. And then that's the exploration in the course. And it's the same with Beyond Good and Evil. I was taking pieces of it, sentences, because you can talk about any given sentence of Nietzsche for like a month because it's so unbelievably dense. He was very ill when he was writing. And so he couldn't write for long. And so he would think and think and think and think and think and then write one sentence. And all that thought was compacted into that sentence. And then he make like a whole book, many books out of those sentences. It's just incredibly dense and entertaining to unpack. So I'm excited about the course on Nietzsche. And I'm excited about the course on, and I redid my Maps of Meaning lecture series. And I managed to condense it to 8 hours, which is the best.
Congratulations.
It took about 32 hours.
Gosh.
So I think that was the most effective exposition of those ideas that I've managed. Samuel Andreev's course on music has got rave reviews. Jonathan Pageau's a lecturer. Jonathan Pageau is a remarkable person. Everything he says is worth listening to. It's like every word. Every time I listen to him, I learn something new and profound. And that's very rare. I'm at the point in my life where if I read a book, it's somewhat rare for the book to have an idea that I don't know. But then I talk to Pageau, it's like everything he says is something new.
Got to find out what he's reading.
Mm-hmm.
You got to find out what he's reading.
Well, he's reading like Orthodox literature from the Middle Ages mostly.
Okay.
So it's arcane, which is partly why he also has a tremendous background knowledge of the world of art. And so he can bring those two things together. But that is what he's reading. And so John Vervaeke is lecturing, James Orr, Brian Keating on cosmology. We have a great lineup. And it's such fun. It's such a fun project. Like, we're quite excited at the moment because we put a lot of money into this project, multiple millions of dollars of personal money. And we have no idea if it was going to be financially successful, if it would work. Like, is there a market for it? Who the hell knows? Did we get the price right? It's $450 a year, which is dirt cheap by university standards. We have 10,000 students already in the first week just for pre-enrollment. And it's very likely that we'll be accredited. So I think we'll have the best of both worlds because we'll be able to offer people, I think, the best courses that have ever been filmed, both in terms of content, but also in terms of production quality. I'm very happy with my daughter, Michaela, and her husband, Jordan Fuller. They built this studio, which is a hard thing to do, and they brought in a production team and they hired editors, and it's really good. The trailers they exceeded my expectations, which were high. I wanted to be sure that he had the best courses ever, but they're like by far the best courses ever.
Yeah. If it's anything like the trailers.
It is.
Oh,
It
gosh,
is.
yeah.
They are like the trailers. That's the thing, is the trailers are actually, they're not puffery for something that's basically dull. The trailers look like the courses. They're very tightly edited. They're full of illustrations. We got lucky because when we filmed the courses, we filmed all of our professors against a white wall with no edges. And at the same time, these AI systems emerged that could do custom-made illustrations for, if you know how to use them. Every course has its own style sheet. Like, it's integrated so the offerings have a cohesion, but they all have their own style sheet. They're beautifully illustrated, and we can fill the background behind the professor with commentary and images and words. And that technology only emerged like 6 months ago. So that
cool.
was perfect timing.
Good timing.
And the universities themselves are doing everything they can to burn themselves to the ground as rapidly as possible. We hardly even have to market because every day some university does something cataclysmically stupid and expensive. What are our hopes? Maybe we can educate 1 million people. Maybe we can educate 100 million people. Who knows? Right? Because there's an unlimited market. The price is very low. It's universally accessible. We're going to be able to translate all the courses into the world's major languages. That's already at hand. There's some expense in it, but if we generate enough capital, that's irrelevant, and we probably will by the looks of things. I mean, who knows? But 10,000 pre-enrollments in the first week is quite promising. And people have actually been positive about the price. So
it's very inexpensive.
People are happy about the price, which means that maybe we undershot it slightly. But, well, because maybe if you get it right, some people
So
are
where do you
upset.
balance the price on that versus getting more revenue to be able to
it's
reinvest
very hard.
back?
Pricing is very, very hard. I mean, there's a lot of things to take into account, right? Because you might say free. Well, free is a stupid price. Free means your platform will be invaded with parasites and bots, right? Because there's no
Success rate is going to be very low.
Well, it's just not a good price. First of all, people are skeptical of anything that's free. Second, people don't want something for nothing if they have a moral compass. Third, if the price is reasonable and not too low, then no one who isn't committed will participate. And we have a social media platform that's part of it. And wouldn't it be nice to have a social media platform that had all the benefits of social media, but that only contained people that were actually committed to the ideal, which would be the expansion of knowledge? Well, so the price serves as a barrier that way, right? Because you're not going to do it if you're just casual or you only want to cause trouble. And so that's a good thing. And then you want to price it high enough so that you can expand rapidly and continue to develop. And you want to price it so that if you produce a profit, you can use the profit to generate new enterprises. There's we want to integrate my son's program Essay, which helps people write. We want to integrate that with the platform. And we have all sorts of ideas for growth, and that requires capital. And so pricing decisions are very difficult. The way you solve that is you charge what the market can bear. That's the rule. And there isn't a better rule than that. And why? Because every single person out there who's deciding whether to purchase something is making a very large number of calculations with every purchasing decision. And there's no way that you can second guess that. Like, you can't replace that with some rationalization. So what's this worth? Well, we sort of went for somewhere between $20 and $200 a month. That was the initial parameters, right? And it took a long time to calibrate down to $450. Why $450? Well, it's not nothing. It's more expensive than the typical Netflix offering, for example. So it distinguishes us from them to some degree. But also, if it's successful, it generates enough capital so that we should be able to expand our offerings very rapidly. And capitalism gets a bad name because people are foolish in their conceptions of money. It's like, well, who needs all that money? Well, your typical capitalist, your atypical capitalist, Elon Musk, he's not Scrooge McDuck. Like, he's not swimming around in a money bin full of coins, right? All he's doing with his money is pursuing more opportunities. And if you generate profit, then, well, you could live a life of parasitical hedonism, but if you have something that's halfway better to do, why the hell would you do that? We have the opportunity in front of us. We have the opportunity in front of us to hypothetically bring the best higher education has to offer to like 100 million people. Well, how could you possibly imagine anything more interesting and rewarding than that? Like, that's what the profit is for. It's like, do I want a Ferrari? Not really. They're too low. I'm old. Like, I have some nice things. I have some nice houses, and that's good, but you have to put your money somewhere. Mostly we put it into more enterprises. And then it's fun to see if you can make those work, right? Because we bit off very complex problems. Can we bring higher education to many, many people at the highest possible quality, at the lowest possible cost? That's a very interesting set of problems. And at the moment, it looks like the answer to that is yes. We have a number of jurisdictions who are interested in accrediting us. And as long as we can negotiate the bureaucratic hurdles, then we should have a full-fledged university, including accreditation, in 6 months. And even if accreditation doesn't work out because the bureaucratic impediments are too great, we'll just negotiate with corporations to accept the credentialing, because the credentialing will be real.
That's where I think education is going anyway. It's online. Like,
Well,
I learn a
how can it not
lot
do this?
from just watching YouTube videos. And I feel like that is the most in-depth that you could get, sometimes in way more detail.
And lots of jobs aren't requiring official college degrees. these
Well,
days.
it's partly because the college degrees don't signify what they did.
Yeah.
And will ours signify that? Yes. Oh, well, also, just for the sake of full disclosure, let's say, there's two pathways you could walk down if you enroll in Peterson Academy. You could just take courses, like you were listening to YouTube videos, let's say, or you could take the exams and walk through the accreditation process. You don't have to do that. And we actually don't know what the comparative market is. A lot of people have asked whether they could take the courses without the exams. Now, so we don't know if the exams are like, will it be 25% of the people who actually want to work towards accreditation, or 10% or 60%? We have no idea. It could be quite low because it could be quite a low number. Don't know. Depends on how many people just want to learn for the sake of learning.
Now, I am curious about this. Do people retain information better in person?
No, I don't think there's any evidence for that. I don't think we know enough about the situational determinants of retention to decide. I suspect there are factors other than in-person versus remote that determine retention.
Probably distraction is my guess.
Sure. And level of engagement with material, something like that. So, but no, I don't think that's a problem. Well, the other thing too is that most university lectures are very low quality. So at the typical university, especially the bigger universities, the research-oriented universities, you can get along quite fine and be a terrible teacher. And so I would say at the typical large state school, 5% of the courses are high quality, and then 40% are okay. And then, there's half that, it's just death to sit through. And there's no excuse for that. That's another thing that we can do at a minimum is raise the bar for the universities. There were universities, the Ivy Leagues, they could have done this 20 years ago. It's like, who are the best lecturers? Because the other thing about in person, if you're lecturing to 1,000 people, it's not in person. You know what I mean? At some point, there's so many people there that it's impersonal. It might as well be replaced by video, as far as I could tell. In fact, you can listen to video at twice as fast. Yeah, that's a big deal, or 4 times as fast. You can review it. Our exams are set up in a very interesting way. So multiple choice exams, but each question will be time-stamped with the lecture. So if you get the question wrong, you can just go to the lecture and you can find out. So you'll be able to use the exams to teach you, right? And so, yeah, it's very exciting. We've got another 50 courses lined up. We're going to produce at least 3 a month, and we might be able to ramp up past that. And we have some wild plans in place too for lectures that I can't discuss yet, but we have some truly revolutionary ideas. And I don't say that lightly. And they're very likely to occur, assuming that, the enrollment rate continues. And so I'm very happy about it. It's gone better than I could have hoped, actually. I was quite stunned by the trailers.
The trailers.
Yeah.
I mean, come on. You can't. Those trailers were something.
Yeah, they're deadly. And they're all like that. Like every single one of them. It's like they're punchy, they're cool. They've got this, like with Greg Hurwitz's course, it's on narrative construction because he's a novelist. It's got this film noir look, pulp fiction look from the 1950s that's cool. The music is well-timed. The editing is really tight. The trailers are coherent. And the professors we have great professors. And I think that we're going to set up a system where we find the best professors in the world and give them carte blanche to teach what they want. That's such a good deal. So,
have you considered having a financial literacy course?
Oh, definitely.
Because I think that is very
definitely.
advanced.
Well, I also want to bring on to the platform economists from the Austrian school, Mises and Hayek, and teach people the basics of free market exchange. And
I would love that.
Oh yeah,
absolutely.
That's it.
But also modern day literacy is
just
extremely
everyday personal finance.
Yeah, well, not only personal finances, but like an orientation towards financial management and success.
Yes.
Like people think, for example, that profit is a dirty word. It's like, well, that's insane. Profit is what enables you to grow. Like that's just, if you have that attitude towards profit, basically what you're doing is punishing yourself morally and ideologically for doing your job well. Well, that's going to demoralize you. So That's not good. It's like pick a hard target, figure out how to solve it, offer the best services you possibly can. And if you can generate money, that indicates you're doing it efficiently, and you can take the capital and go do something else interesting with it. And there's no end to that. Like there's no end to the number of courses we can offer and the number of professors we can bring onto the platform. And obviously, as it's successful, it's going to be even easier for us now to attract high quality lectures, because we can say, well, this is what your course will look like, and this is how many students you'll have. Like, who the hell's going to say no to that if they actually want to teach? It's such a good deal. If you write an academic book, you're lucky if 5,000 people buy it. Like, really, that's a major success. And maybe half of those read it. Well, with a good course, maybe you'll have an audience of 1 million. It's 1,000 times more successful. So, yeah, we're very excited about it. And it looks like it might be working. So, and soon we're going to have monthly payment structures, and I'm going to negotiate with corporations to offer scholarships. And so, one of the things we'd like to do is find the 10,000 smartest young people in the world, right? Because there's all these developing countries where there are geniuses lying latent here and there. Their cognitive resources aren't being utilized. There's some Elon Musk in India in some poor family. Maybe he'll never have the opportunity to move ahead and to offer the world what he could offer. We are in a position where we can be able to find people like that. I'm going to go to corporations and say, buy 1,000 scholarships. We'll screen people. We'll bring bright people in from all over the developing world and educate them.
I love that.
Then we'll be able to hook them up with potential employers. We'll set up a platform where we shouldn't be able to identify the smartest and hardest working people in the world. It shouldn't be that hard to hook them up with employers. It's like, look, they're stellar. They work hard. They're committed. They're all in. They're educated. They're not ideologically addled. It's like, you want to hire them? Would you pay for the privilege of hiring them?
That would be incredible to utilize your tests with employment. That you could basically just select, hey, these are the people that we believe are the most qualified based on our rankings.
Right.
And just have them there.
Right. Well, that's
such an efficient society where it's like, yep, you just pick and choose that person.
Right.
That would be incredible.
Definitely. Yeah, well, that's been a dream since 1992. I talked to my partner, Daniel, about building an online psychometric battery that would enable us to find the smartest people in the world who don't have any opportunities. We don't want to let that kind of genius go to waste. That's foolish. Deadly foolish. What's one person like Elon Musk worth? What's he worth? 150 billion?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe there's 1,000 people out there like that.
Yeah.
Because there could be.
Yeah.
All right.
Cool.
Jordan,
Thank
you so much for coming on the show. It really means a lot. Really appreciate it. Thank you guys for watching. Check out Peterson Academy. It'll be linked down below. Thank you.
Till next time.
Thank you, guys.